All right, we are now into Unit 2 of the journey through the Hebrew Bible. And in this unit, we will look at stories from a period called the Judges to a period called the United Monarchy. The first of these stories is about a woman called Deborah. Now, Deborah was a housewife. She was a prophet. She was also a judge. She was a song composer because we have a song written by her. She was also a warrior. She actually went to battle in support of a male judge called Barak. What's important about Deborah is that she lived at a time when Israel was in its worst period. This is the period of the Judges. This is often called the Dark Ages. This was the time when women had no voice, and yet here was a woman with lots of voice. This was a time when everybody misbehaved, but here was a prophet of God who did all the right things. She must have been a woman of great courage too, because when she asked Barak, God has chosen you to go and defeat the enemies of Israel. Guess what he said? Well, I will go and lead the armies of Israel, but only if you accompany me. Now, don't get Barak wrong. He was not a coward. I think Barak knew that God was special in a relationship with Deborah, and if Deborah is with him, then he's guaranteed victory. He needed that connection with God that she brought into this work because of who she was. Now, we even know the name of her husband. He must have been an important official. Usually you will not know that. His name was Lapidoth, but we don't know very much else about him. What is clear about Deborah is that she fulfilled everything God asked her to do, and even had the time to write a beautiful song towards God, a song to praise his victory. Most of the early songs of Israel are songs of victory, what we call victory chants. And so here was a woman who worked together with a male judge, Barak, in support, and even went to battle, went to war with him in order to do her work. She's described that as a judge, she sat under a tree, kind of like in this picture behind me. She sat under that tree and people would come to her and bring their cases, and she would settle them and she would do her work. Now you can be a Deborah. You may think I'm really not much, nobody. Who knows what you can do if God chooses you? Our next judge is a very interesting man. His name is Gideon. Here was a man who was called by God. And right from the onset, it was known that he was chosen by God. God saw something special in him, but Gideon was unsure. He felt he wasn't important enough. He felt his family, his tribe, nobody is really that important, not well known. And he was very hesitant. He turned out to be a great general, a great warrior, a great judge, because the judges were actually warriors. And so to make sure that this was really God speaking to him, he says to God, okay, I will go to war, but I'm going to ask you for signs, okay, God? It's very dangerous to ask God for signs because you might actually get them, and then you have no choice after that. And so he asked for a sign. God gave it to him, and he says, wait a minute. Maybe the sign was too easy, so he reverses the sign. You can read in the Bible the sign. And God fulfills it again. But in actuality, God had given him a first sign when the angel appeared and called him, and there was the fire that consumed the food, and so on. So he actually had three signs that God gave him. Gideon grudgingly finally says, okay, God, I will go. After all, you've answered me. And God decides to reverse the signs on Gideon. When the army was gathered, it was a volunteer army. God says, too many soldiers. And Gideon's like, what? I only have 32,000. My enemies have at least 100,000. And in those days, the numbers mattered in a battle. God says, no, too many. What to do? Well, speak to your army. If there are people who say, we're afraid, we'd like to go home, we need to take care of our family, let them go back. Guess how many people went back? 22,000. God came a second time. Remember how many signs Gideon got? He says, too many. Gideon is shocked. God, I only have 10,000 left. Too many. What to do? Well, take them to the river, okay? There's a river in front. They must cross the river to get to the enemy. And people who stop and drink and enjoy the water, send them home. Only those who lap up some water and keep running and get to the other side, you can take them to battle. Guess how many soldiers he had left? 300. So he asked God for 3 signs. God tested him 3 times. Only then was Gideon ready to win a great big battle with just 300 soldiers. And these were the first famous 300 long before the Spartan 300 against the Persians. And Gideon won this great victory because he finally learned to completely trust in God, even if his resources seemed very small. He thought he was unimportant. He thought his army was too small, but he won a great victory because of God. If Gideon was a strange choice, hesitant warrior, then the next judge that we will look at is an even more intriguing choice. Jephthah was disowned by his family at a young age. He became an outlaw, sort of Robin Hood in ancient Israel. He lived with a band of merry men. They robbed rich people and apparently helped the poor, and so on and so forth. But when the going got tough, this man and his band of warriors and mercenaries had become great warriors, become great fighters. And so the people of Gilead, who had pushed him out, had disowned him, including his family. Now that they were in trouble, they came back running to him. We need your help. Can you please lead us out? And so he gets chosen by God to be a judge. But he wasn't sure if God was really with him. And so he makes a bargain with God. He says, God, if you will give me a victory over this enemy, I will offer you a sacrifice, the very first thing that comes out of my house when I return from battle. Well, when he won the victory, came home, his only daughter came out. We don't know, the story doesn't confirm what he did with her, except that he kept his vow to God. But what we see in the life of Jephthah, because of his rather mixed up life, he also had rather mixed up value. He thought that he must bargain with God to get God's help. He thought of making a rash promise without realizing the consequences to himself and to his family. You see, it's important to recognize that God can use us even when we don't fully understand him, even when our values are still mixed up. But the story of Jephthah also tells us to be careful about making promises to God, because some promises we might not be able to keep so easily. But God still has a place in his work for each one of us, and he does for you. You might not seem like such a nice guy like Jephthah or such a nice person, but who knows what God can do with you. Well, the most famous judge, and the book of Judges says he was the last judge, technically not, in that book he was, is the man who had the strength of Superman, the man who could fly or run as fast as the Flash. His name was Samson. Miracle baby, miracle birth, chosen from birth, chosen to be part of a special group known as the Nazarites. And one of the distinctive features of the Nazarite was the long hair. From the time they were born, their hair could not be cut. Nothing special about the hair, but it was a symbol of the presence of God, of the power of God. So here was this Flash Superman, the Superman Flash, but he had a weakness. He somehow loved Philistine women. God had told the Israelites not to mix marriage with the other people. But Samson had a choice of any girl in Israel but he fell in love with Philistines twice. The first one, he got married, and the whole thing turned sour because of the opposition of the Philistines. It ended up with a big case of tragedy and revenge and so on. The second one is the famous story. A woman called Delilah, whose very name in English means betrayal. When a woman betrays a man, when a girl betrays a boy, when a wife betrays her husband, we say it's a Delilah. However, the story is that she managed to convince him to tell the secret so that the Philistines could capture him and imprison him. She gets to cut his hair. After many trials, he didn't give up his secret right away. He tried, but then love got the better of him. He gave up his hair. He lost his strength, at least for a while. He was paraded, blind, and bald, kind of a little bit like me, I suppose, right now. The Philistines had so much fun with him. Then they had this great big celebration, brought him to the main temple. And in that last moment of his life, he prayed to God for strength. And he says, God, I'm sorry I failed you, but now please be with me one more time. Grant me the strength I have had before. And he took hold of the two main pillars of that huge temple of the Philistines, pulled the pillars together and crashed the whole temple. And it says that in his death, he actually killed more Philistines than when he was alive. Now, what would his life have been like if he had followed God more closely? And yet, God never abandoned him. Typical of the period of Judges, God was with him. Samson fails, but Samson emerges victorious in a rather tragic way. We will all have failures, but God is still with us and he can help us. In English, when a person has many jobs or responsibilities, we say that he wears many caps or many hats. This is my exercise hat. Every time I go for a walk, I wear this cap. This is my travel cap. So when I go on some tour thing, I always wear this one. It kind of protects most of your head and neck. This is what I call my funny French cap, because I don't really use it. I only use it once for some musical performance, and so a different kind of cap. And well, here is my special collection cap. I love Liverpool football team, so this is my Liverpool collection cap. My most important cap is academic cap. This is the one for my doctoral PhD graduation cap. It's has this golden tassel and so on. If you are a Jew, a Jewish male or a Jewish man, and you go to the synagogue for worship, then you would wear one of these little caps. It's called a kippah. Now, the person in the Bible who has so many caps because he had so many things to do is a man called Samuel. He is the person between the judges and the kings. He was a priest, he was a prophet, he was a judge, he was an anointer of kings, he was a warrior. He had so many different jobs that he had to do. He had a special birth, also a miracle birth. He was chosen by God from a very young age, dedicated to God by a very devoted mother. He was a light in a time of darkness when everything around him was going wrong in relationship to God. Samuel stood strong. And he was the man who kept things going, you might say. When it looked like the nation would crash and burn, Samuel kept it alive. But he also had the misfortune of seeing the people ask for a king. We don't want any more judges. We don't want this confusion anymore. Give us a king. We want to be like other nations. Samuel was so sad. God told him, don't worry, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. And so the man with many caps, the man with many hats, was special to God. And he lived in a special time of history. Who knows what you can become if you wear many caps for God you can also be special. In this unit, we will transition from judges to kings. And the first king was a man called Saul. Here was a man who had a very good look, who was handsome, who was really tall, who was taller than everyone else in Israel. He was the kind of person that everybody take a look and say, oh, he is really the one to be the king. But Saul did not have a mind or a heart to really follow God. So he was chosen. He was special. He was the very first king of Israel. He was anointed by Samuel. But eventually he was rejected by God. And the reason for Saul's rejection is he suffered from a virus. The virus is called power. We have a saying in English that power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. He thought he was an absolute king, did not realize that God was the king above him. So he tries to do things his own way. He did not pay close attention. He was not good at following the instructions that God sent through Samuel. God never spoke directly to Saul. Samuel was the voice of God to him. But he didn't always listen. He did whatever he wanted. And when he finally disobeyed a command of God to get rid of the Amalekites, but he spared some things for personal reasons, for sacrifice reasons, God says, no more. This is it. I will take the kingdom from you and give to somebody else who will follow me very closely. And so Saul had the privilege, imagine, to be the first. He could have established a dynasty of kings. But he didn't really want to listen. He didn't really want to follow. I am the king. I have the power. I can do what I want. Now, some of us may not be kings, but we still act with that arrogance that Saul had. Now, through Christian history, it's been believed that the number one sin is pride or arrogance. Do you suffer from that problem? Then you may meet the tragedy of Saul. To get a lot and lose everything. If not, you can find very useful service for God and for community. The second king of Israel became the most famous king of their entire history. He is even seen as the father of the Messiah. So when Jesus came, he is called the son of David. David was 17 years of age when he was chosen by Samuel to be the next king. There are many stories about David, some really good ones, some not so good ones. But the Bible itself evaluates David on three things. The first of these is that he was a shepherd king. He was a genuine leader. He was a person who really cared for the kingdom, who really cared for his people, who really cared for Israel. And the reason is he was a shepherd. He had been a shepherd through his younger life, and he knew what it was like to care for difficult people like sheep. He even wrote one of the most well-known, one of the most famous psalms in the Bible, to this day known as the Shepherd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, he says. I have everything I need. I do not have to fear anything. I can always live in the presence of this God. The second thing the Bible says about David is he is a man after God's own heart. In fact, the Hebrew words sound more like God's pulse and David's pulse were at the same rate. You know, if you take your pulse, every one of you has a different speed. Some a little faster, some a little slower, some kind of a long pulse, some a very quick pulse. Nobody has exactly the same pulse. And so doctors give us a range. You know, at your age, for your good health, your pulse should be at this rate. Okay. There are machines, there are gadgets, even some of the modern mobile phones have health apps and you can, measure your own pulse. Imagine what it means to say that David and God had the same pulse rate, a man after God's own heart. The third thing the Bible tells us about David, he is the sweet singer of Israel. Nearly 40% of the Psalms in the book of Psalms were written by David. As a single writer, he wrote the most songs for Israel. He was a singer. He sang to his sheep. He sang when Saul was going insane, and he sang songs to God. He had all kinds of songs. He played instruments, a little harp, a little lyre, a flute. He was the true musician of the Bible, the number one musician. He wrote choir pieces. He wrote worship pieces. And so this man was not just a king, David. He was not just the great ancestor of Jesus. He was a shepherd king. He was a man after God's own heart. He was a sweet singer of Israel. It's wonderful what you can do when your life is truly dedicated to God, the way that David was. David's son Solomon became the next king of Israel, and the Bible says he was the wisest man that ever lived. The reason is this: when he was coronated as king, God came to him in a dream and says, "What do you want? Anything you want, I will give you. Money, wealth, success." Solomon says, "I only want one thing, Lord. Please give me wisdom so I can rule your people." And God was so pleased with him, he says, "I will give you wisdom and I will give you everything else." Unfortunately, by getting so much blessing, Solomon ended up living on thin ice. Do you know what it means to live on thin ice? It's like walking on a lake with an ice sheet at the top as it freezes in the winter. But if you put too much pressure on it, the ice will crack and you can fall inside. That was Solomon's life. He had too many wives. He worshipped too many gods, following his wives or to please his wives. He got too much money. He got too much power, too much success, and maybe too much wisdom. So much wisdom that he couldn't apply them to his own life until the end of his life, when he finally wrote a book called Kohelet, known in English as Ecclesiastes. And in that book, Solomon tells us that everything you get in life, and he says, "I have gotten everything in life." Everything you get in life, if you forget God, if you ignore God, if you try to live without God, it is like trying to chase the wind. He says you will chase and you will chase the wind, but you will never catch it. So wealth, success, money, power, pleasure, feasting, anything you have in life, everything you have in life, you can have the best cars, the biggest houses, the most money in the bank. But if life is without God, you will end up like Solomon, walking on thin ice and discover you've simply been chasing the wind. And so near the end of his life, he tells people, remember God. He is your creator. Enjoy your life while you are young, but remember that God is there to watch over you. I think if we can listen, this is the wisest thing that Solomon ever said. We can enjoy life. But if we do so without God, then we're chasing the wind. We'll never catch. But if we do it with God, then even if we don't have the greatest success in the world or the most money, we will still be the happiest. We will still be the most fulfilled. That is wisdom. Maybe this is why he's called the wisest man who ever lived.